No one wanted to marry the orphan child's mom. Only a lonely lumberjack made her his wife. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Coldwater Ridge carried the sounds of saws and axes long before the sun reached the town. The main street was nothing more than planks laid over frozen mud, lined with a mercantile, a saloon, and a few board-sided buildings that leaned under their own weight. Smoke from pine logs clung low in the air, and every breath came out sharp. Clara Whitlow stood outside the mercantile with her daughter, Liddy, holding her hand tight. Clara was in her mid-20s, the kind of woman whose face showed both youth and too many hard miles. Her dress was clean but threadbare, the bodice stretched from use. One seam at the neckline pulled and stitched back unevenly. She had walked through towns before and knew the looks. Men appraising her as if she were an animal, women glancing and then turning away. Today was no different. She felt the weight of the stares, the whispers about her being a widow, about her dragging a child around like a sack of stones no one wanted. Her jaw tightened. She had left Missouri with one thing in mind: to keep her daughter alive after her husband had died of fever. The gravesite had been shallow, barely marked. Every decision since had been about moving forward, finding food, and refusing to leave Liddy behind. Clara feared the same outcome for her child: sickness, hunger, abandonment, but she never let it show on her face. Liddy, only 6, pressed her small hand into her mother's skirt, her cheeks pale from the cold. She clutched a hard bread heel that someone had given them days earlier. Her fingers were red and raw, and she coughed into her sleeve. Clara knew the girl needed warmth and steady meals. She told herself every hour she would find a way, though the truth was she was running out of places to turn. The men by the stove inside the mercantile let their talk slip through the cracked door. Pretty enough, but trouble. Another voice. No man wants to raise another man's child. Clara heard it clear and steady. She kept her eyes straight ahead, not letting her mouth move, not giving them the satisfaction. But her heart beat hard in her chest because she knew they were right in one sense. No one was offering help, and time was short. Jonah Wild came down off the ridge that morning with his usual purpose. He was 33, broad-shouldered from years of swinging an axe, his shirt sleeves carrying the resin and pitch of pine. He had a small scar near his hairline, the mark of a falling branch years earlier, and a right hand that stiffened in the cold from an old break. He lived alone in a cabin above town, keeping to himself, bringing cordwood down to trade for flour, beans, and lamp oil. Most in town knew him as quiet, steady, not inclined to gossip or crowds. Some called him strange for living alone, but none questioned his work ethic. Jonah had his reasons for solitude. His brother had been killed in a logging accident when they were young, a tree falling wrong, the kind of mistake that stayed with a man forever. Jonah carried the weight of it, blaming himself for not warning quick enough. Since then, he kept to the ridge, working, keeping his head down. His mission was simple: survive the winters, stay out of trouble, and make sure no one relied on him. That morning, he saw Clara and the child as soon as he stepped out of the mercantile with a sack of flour over his shoulder. He noticed the girl's blue-tinged fingers, her scarfless neck, the way Clara placed herself between the child and the world. He didn't stare, but he didn't walk past without thought either. Inside, he had bought his usual staples, and at the counter his hand had paused over a stack of woolen scarves. They were coarse but warm. He added one to his order without comment, feeling the clerk's raised eyebrow, but not explaining himself. When he came out, he stopped briefly before Clara and Liddy. He held out the scarf. "For the wind," he said, voice low, flat, not unkind. Liddy looked up, wide-eyed, but didn't take it until Clara gave a small nod. Jonah didn't linger, didn't ask questions. He walked on down the boardwalk toward the livery, his boots heavy on the planks. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to call after him, to say thank you, but her throat stuck. Gratitude felt dangerous, like owing something. Still, she wrapped the scarf around her daughter's neck, pulling it snug, and when Liddy smiled for the first time in days, Clara's resolve wavered. For one breath, she felt less alone. That night, Clara tried the boarding house again, offering to sew or wash in return for a place to sleep. The matron shook her head. Not with the girl. Can't have children underfoot. The words landed like a blow. Clara had no choice but to take Liddy to the livery. The loft smelled of hay and horses, but it was shelter. Clara tucked her daughter under her shawl, listening to her cough and telling herself they would find something better tomorrow. Later, boots crunched in the yard below. Clara froze, her heart thudding. Through the gap in the boards, she saw Jonah pass by with a lantern. He stopped, hearing the cough. He didn't call up or demand to know who was there. Instead, he said something on the step outside the loft and walked on. Clara waited until his light faded, then crept down. On the step lay his red bandana wrapped around 2 biscuits. She lifted it slowly, her throat tightening again. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. She carried it back up to Liddy, broke 1 biscuit in half, and pressed it into her daughter's hands. The girl's eyes lit with relief as she ate. Clara sat in the dark, holding the bandana in her lap. She wanted to return it, to give something back. But when morning came and she tried, Jonah only looked at her once and said, "Keep it." Then he pointed toward the ridge. "Plenty of room up there. Warm stove. You can use it while the snow holds." Clara's mind raced. Was it safe? What did he expect? What did it mean for her child? Fear mixed with relief, and she weighed the choice. She had seen men demand more for less. But Jonah's tone was level, not pressing. He was simply offering. Her decision came when she looked at Liddy's thin shoulders, the child's breath clouding in the air. Clara tightened the scarf around her daughter's neck, nodded once, and said, "All right." Jonah didn't smile or speak further. He only shifted the flour sack on his shoulder and started up the road. Clara gathered her daughter's hand, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt a sliver of ground under her feet that did not tilt. The road to the ridge was longer than Clara expected. Mud froze stiff in the ruts, and the climb left her breathing hard. Jonah walked ahead, carrying the flour sack on one shoulder and a coil of rope at his hip. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, only slowed his pace when he noticed Clara's steps falter or Liddy tugging at her mother's skirt with tired legs. Clara studied him when he wasn't looking, the way his frame filled his shirt, the solid weight of him, the way his boots dug into the frozen ground. He wasn't a man trying to impress. He was simply steady, and that steadiness mattered. The cabin showed itself after returning the trail, a plain square structure with a pitched roof and a stovepipe leaning at a slight angle. Smoke rose in a thin column. Behind it, the woods stretched high, pines heavy with frost. Jonah lifted the latch and swung the door wide without ceremony. Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the smell of wood smoke and pine pitch. A table stood near the window, its surface marked by years of use. A bed, narrow but neatly made, sat against the wall, and in the corner a small iron stove clicked as heat pressed through its sides. There was no excess, only what was needed: tools hung on pegs, shelves with jars of beans and flour, a coil of fishing line, a whetstone. Clara's eyes swept the room quickly. She needed to know if it was safe. No bottles left carelessly, no other men's boots by the door, no women's belongings in corners. Just one man's life, tidy, restrained. She felt some of the fear in her chest ease, though she didn't let her shoulders show it. Jonah set the flour sack down and unrolled his blanket onto the floor. "Bed's for you and the girl," he said. His tone left no room for argument, no opening for misunderstanding. Clara hesitated, waiting for some shift, some hint of expectation. But he turned to the stove, opened the firebox, and laid in more wood. The crackle filled the silence. Liddy wandered near the stove, her scarf still snug around her neck. She spread her hands toward the warmth, and the color started to return to her cheeks. She looked around the cabin with wide eyes and then tugged Clara's sleeve. "It's warm, Mama." Clara nodded, lowering to Liddy's height. "Yes, it is." Inside, she thought. Maybe for the first time since the graveside, her child might sleep without shivering. Jonah set out a tin cup for each of them, poured water from a bucket, and slid it across the table. He added beans to the kettle, a scrap of salt pork for flavor. Supper was simple, but it filled the air with a smell that made Liddy lean forward. nose twitching. Clara folded her hands in her lap, uneasy at eating from another man's table, but the hunger in her daughter's eyes made the choice easy. She took the cup and nodded once toward Jonah, her closest thing to thanks. While Jonah cut fresh kindling, Clara took a rag and wiped the table down. It was habit as much as courtesy. She noticed a thin film of dust on the windows and wiped that too. She wasn't thinking of ownership, only that if they were to stay, even for a night, she needed to leave it better than she found it. Jonah watched from the corner of his eye, but didn't stop her. He only noted the way she moved, efficient, practical, careful to keep herself between the girl and any opening door. When night pressed in, Jonah stepped outside, boots crunching on frozen ground. He didn't say why, but Clara understood. He was giving her space, showing he wasn't a man to press into corners. She used that time to remove her daughter's shoes, rub warmth in her feet, and pull the quilt over her small frame. She pinned her own neckline where the stitching had come loose again and laid her shawl out to dry by the stove. Jonah came back in after a while, stamping snow from his boots. He didn't look toward the bed, didn't ask anything of her. He simply unrolled his coat by the door and lay down near the hearth. The sound of his slow breathing filled the cabin as the stove clicked and the night wrapped them all. Clara lay awake a long time, thoughts moving faster than her tired body. Why had he done this? Offered space, given food, when so many others had turned away. What did he really want? She weighed the risks. But when she looked at Liddy's face, slack with sleep and color returning to her cheeks, Clara told herself the truth. There was no safer choice left. In the silence of the cabin, with a stranger sleeping only feet away, she realized she wasn't afraid in the way she expected. She was cautious, yes, but not in danger. She turned on her side, one arm around her daughter, and for the first time in weeks, she let her eyes close knowing the stove would still be warm in the morning. The morning came with the rattle of the stovepipe and the thin light through the window. Clara woke first, the weight of her daughter's small body still against her arm. She lay still for a moment, listening. Jonah was already moving. She could hear the dull rhythm of his axe outside, each strike measured, steady, not hurried. She sat up, her eyes sweeping the room again. It was still plain and bare, but now with Liddy's shoes tucked neatly by the bed and her shawl folded across the chair, it felt less like a stranger's place and more like shelter. Liddy stirred, blinking at the fire's glow. She smiled when she saw her mother, her cheeks pink from warmth instead of wind. Clara brushed the girl's hair back from her forehead and thought of how quickly children forget hardship once comfort returns. But the thought also reminded her of risk, how easily it could all be lost if she misjudged this man or this place. When Jonah stepped inside, carrying a small armload of split wood, the smell of fresh pine followed him. He set the pieces neatly by the stove, dusting frost from his sleeves. His eyes flicked once to Clara, then to Liddy, and then back to the wood. He didn't comment on their presence, didn't ask what they planned to do next. His silence gave Clara space, but it also left her wondering. Was she expected to leave after a day, a week? Did he mean for them to stay until spring, or just until the weather shifted? The beans from last night's kettle were set back on the fire. Clara felt uneasy taking more without giving back. So while the food warmed, she took Jonah's shirts from a peg and looked at their seams. The collars were frayed, the cuffs worn. She asked without raising her voice, "Do you mind?" Jonah shook his head once. "Do what you need." She mended quietly, her needle moving fast, while he stacked the rest of the wood outside. Liddy busied herself with scraps of fabric from her mother's bundle. She tried to sew crooked stitches, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Jonah paused at the doorway, watching her for a moment, and something softened in his expression, though he didn't let it linger. Clara noticed. Over the course of the day, a rhythm began to take shape. Jonah worked outside cutting and hauling, his movements heavy but certain. Clara kept the cabin orderly, cooking what little they had, sweeping the floor, patching clothes. Liddy gathered small pieces of kindling from the yard and carried them in, proud of her task. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt her mind settle. There was no promise here, no guarantees, but there was structure, and structure meant survival. By evening, Jonah pulled a block of pine to the table and began working with a hand plane. He didn't announce what he was doing, just set his weight into the tool, the shavings curling onto the floor. Clara watched him from the stove, curious. The wood was being shaped with care, each pass precise. She realized after a moment, it was a rail for a cradle. Her breath caught, though she said nothing. She wondered if he knew what it meant for her to see that. Later, after supper, she hung her dress by the stove to dry where snow had dampened the hem. She pinned the neckline neatly again, determined not to let where show more than it already did. Jonah, seated across the room, kept his eyes on the flames, giving her privacy without making a show of it. That small courtesy meant more to her than words. When Liddy fell asleep curled on a quilt near the hearth, Clara sat back in the chair with her hands folded, exhaustion pressing down, but her mind restless. She thought of the town below, the looks, the whispers, the closed doors. She thought of the choice she had made to follow Jonah to the ridge. Was it desperation? Yes. But watching her daughter breathe steady in the glow of a warm stove, she told herself it was also the right choice. Jonah shifted slightly, his chair creaking. He spoke for the first time since supper, voice low, steady. Snow will come hard soon. Best to settle in before it does. Clara looked at him, studying his face in the lamplight. There was no demand in his tone, no hidden bargain, just a plain statement of fact. She felt tension leave her shoulders slowly. For now, at least, she knew where they belonged. The fire burned down to embers, and in the silence of the cabin, three lives that had started the day as strangers were already moving towards something that looked like a household. Snow had started to gather along the ridge, dusting the roof of Jonah's cabin and packing into the ruts of the road. Inside, the stove burned steady, but Clara knew the world outside was already turning harder. She sat at the table mending one of Liddy's dresses, adding a patch across the knee where the cloth had thinned from travel. The cabin was warmer, safer, but questions still pressed at her. How long would Jonah allow them to stay? Did he see them as a burden, or had he already decided otherwise? She could not ask outright. To ask meant admitting how dependent she felt, and she had learned not to show that kind of weakness to men. Jonah had his own quiet burdens. Each day, he worked the timber line, felling smaller trees and cutting them into rounds for trade. His body carried the wear of it, shoulders stiff, hands calloused deep, but he moved with purpose. When he returned each evening, he never complained. He set his tools down, stacked wood, and nodded toward the stove as if to say, "Here, this will keep you warm another night." Clara wondered if he ever resented the extra mouths at his table, but she never saw it in his face. Word from town did not take long to reach them. Clara noticed it first when she walked down to the mercantile alone one morning with Liddy to fetch a spool of thread. The shopkeeper leaned against the counter and gave her a smile that carried more judgment than warmth. "I hear you've made yourself comfortable up there," he said, tapping the wood counter with one finger. "Man like Wild, quiet fellow. You ought to be grateful." Clara's stomach turned at the implication. She lifted her chin and said only, "I paid for thread." Her voice didn't tremble, but inside she felt the sting. People already had their version of the story, and she had no way to change their talk. She walked out with Liddy's hand tight in hers, telling herself she would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her shame. That evening, Jonah noticed her silence. He was not a man to pry, but when he set down the day's haul of kindling, he asked, "Something happened in town?" Clara hesitated. She weighed whether telling him would bring more trouble or less. Finally, she said, "They've decided what you've done for us means I owe you." Jonah's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he threw another log onto the fire, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. Then he said, low but steady, "You don't owe me." He left it there, but the firmness in his tone settled something in her chest. Later, when Liddy was asleep by the stove, Clara stepped onto the porch. The night air was biting cold, her breath rising in clouds. Jonah followed after a while, not to crowd her, but to stand beside her. For a long time, neither spoke. The woods creaked under the weight of frost, the sound of the mill faint and distant. Finally, Jonas said, "My brother died under a bad tree. Been quiet since. Easier that way." Clara turned her face toward him. "My husband died of fever," she answered. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied as she added, "I buried him with no marker. Just kept walking after." She didn't speak of the fear, of nights hiding in barns, of the way she'd wondered if her daughter would survive the next week. But she didn't have to. The silence that followed held it all. Jonah didn't reach for her, didn't try to offer comfort he didn't know how to give. Instead, he stood with her until their breath matched in the cold air. That was enough. Clara realized she had not spoken those words aloud since the day she laid her husband in the ground. Inside, the stove burned steady. Clara returned to her daughter and brushed her hair back from her forehead as the girl slept. She thought of what the townspeople had said, of the judgment they carried like stones ready to throw. But here, in the cabin, none of it reached her. Jonah had made his position plain. She owed nothing. That gave her more strength than she expected. By the time she pulled the quilt over herself and her child, she understood something new. The talk in town would not stop, but inside these walls, she was no longer just a widow with baggage. She was part of a household, however quiet and unspoken it was. And for now, that was enough to keep her going. The next days rolled into a rhythm, each one marked by the steady sound of Jonah's axe and the scratch of Clara's needle. The cabin had grown warmer, not just from the stove, but from routine itself. Yet beneath it all, Clara carried a quiet unease. What if this life was too fragile? What if one accident or one choice shattered the safety they had only just found? That fear proved itself one gray afternoon. Jonah had set the kettle on the stove while tending to the fire, his right hand stiff in the cold. When the handle slipped and the boiling water sloshed across his forearm, the sound he made was not a cry, but a hiss forced between his teeth. The skin flushed red almost instantly, angry and raw. He tried to turn away, muttering a curse under his breath, but Clara was on her feet before she thought. "Sit," she told him, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. He resisted at first, reaching for a rag to wipe at the burn, but she caught his wrist and forced him down into the chair by the table. "You'll make it worse," she said, steadying her tone. Jonah watched her as she worked, his eyes narrowing not from anger, but from the discomfort of letting someone else take control. Clara fetched a clean cloth, cooled it with water, and pressed it gently against the burn. He winced, but didn't pull away. Inside, Clara's hands shook slightly. She hadn't tended a man like this since her husband's fever years ago, but she didn't let it show. Liddy sat nearby, silent, her wide eyes watching every move. Clara forced herself to stay calm for her daughter's sake as much as Jonas. When the burn was cleaned and wrapped with a strip torn from her own petticoat, Clara tied the knot firm. She met Jonah's eyes only briefly. "You need to leave it covered. Don't argue with me." Jonah gave a faint nod. "All right." His voice was low, restrained, but there was no challenge in it. The silence afterward was heavy, not awkward but charged. Jonah sat back, his arm cradled against his chest, while Clara cleaned up the basin. She felt his gaze on her, not invasive but present, as if he was studying the way she moved, the way she took charge without hesitation. For him, it was unusual. Since his brother's death, he hadn't allowed anyone into his space deeply enough to tend his wounds or share his burdens. Now, watching Clara move about his cabin, he realized he didn't mind. That evening, supper was quieter than usual. Clara kept glancing at Jonah's bandaged arm, making sure he wasn't trying to use it. Liddy broke the silence at one point, saying softly, "Mama always makes things better." Clara's cheeks warmed, embarrassed at the child's words, but Jonah only gave a small nod in agreement. After Liddy fell asleep on the rug by the stove, Clara sat in the chair across from Jonah. He tried to rise when the fire dipped low, but she stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Stay put. I'll tend it." She added another log herself, sparks catching up the chimney. For a long time, they sat in the dim glow of the stove. Clara thought of all the nights she had spent alone on the road, tending her child with no one to steady her. Now, here was a man who had offered nothing more than a roof and a stove, Yet somehow it was more than anyone else had given her in months. She felt gratitude, but also caution. Gratitude could too easily slide into dependence, and dependence could turn dangerous. Jonah, for his part, felt something different stir. He had taken them in out of instinct, not planning beyond the first night, but now he saw Clara's strength in the small acts. How she patched, cleaned, mended, and carried her daughter's safety on her shoulders with no complaint. He realized he wanted her there, not out of pity, but because the cabin felt different with her and the girl inside. Less hollow, less like a place waiting for silence to bury him again. Neither spoke those thoughts aloud. But when Clara finally rose to lay a quilt over her daughter, Jonah's eyes followed her, steady, not hidden. And when she turned back, she held his gaze a moment longer than she meant to. It wasn't a bargain or a promise or anything defined. But both of them felt the shift, that what had started as charity was becoming something neither of them could ignore. That night, Clara lay with her daughter in the bed, but her thoughts stayed at the table, where Jonah had sat with his arm wrapped and his eyes steady on her. And for the first time since her husband's death, she let herself imagine a future that wasn't only survival. The snow deepened as December pressed in, weighing down the pines and softening the trail down into town. Inside the cabin, the stove was kept going day and night, the steady crackle becoming as familiar as breath. Clara had fallen into the rhythm of it, stoking the fire, washing Jonah's shirts, setting beans and cornbread on the table. She tried not to think too far ahead, but each day that passed with Jonah's quiet steadiness made it harder to believe this was temporary. Jonah's arm healed slowly under her bandages. He tested it too early, trying to split wood one-handed, and she scolded him without hesitation. He took it in silence, but later Clara saw him sit with the girl and show her how to sort kindling by size, letting her believe she was helping him rather than being a burden. Clara watched from the window, her hands still on the dishcloth, her chest tightening at the simple sight. No man had ever looked at her child that way before. Not as an inconvenience, not as a weight, but as part of the work worth doing. One evening, when Lydia had fallen asleep on the quilt by the stove with her doll clutched to her chest, Clara stepped outside to cool her face. The cold bit instantly, sharp enough to sting her lungs. The ridge stretched silent around the cabin, the sky filled with low stars. She pulled her shawl tight, not realizing Jonah had followed until his boots crunched on the porch behind her. He didn't crowd her, just leaned against the rail, his breath turning to mist in the air. For a while, they both looked out at the snow without speaking. Clara felt her nerves stir. She knew he could have stayed inside, but he hadn't. He'd chosen to stand beside her. Finally, she turned, her eyes finding his in the dim light from the window. His face was steady, unreadable, but not cold. Without thinking it through, she lifted her hand and set her palm against his jaw. His beard was rough under her fingers, and the scar near his hairline caught the edge of the lamplight. She didn't know why she did it, whether it was gratitude, longing, or just needing to see if he would let her. Jonah didn't flinch or pull away. His hand came to rest at the small of her back, firm but not demanding. He lowered his head slowly and kissed her, the kind of kiss that was careful, steady, as if he was afraid of frightening her off. Clara's breath caught, not in fear, but in surprise at how natural it felt. She closed her eyes, leaning into it. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she wasn't bracing herself against the world. They parted slowly, foreheads touching, both of them breathing in the cold air, as if to steady themselves. Neither spoke. Words would have cheapened it. The silence said more than enough. They went back inside, the warmth of the stove pressing against them. Clara knelt to check on Liddy, who stirred but didn't wake. Jonah busied himself with the fire, though his movements were slower than usual, his thoughts plainly elsewhere. When Clara straightened, she found him watching her, not in the way men had looked at her in town. There was no possession, no judgment, just a man seeing her plainly and without disguise. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks but didn't turn away. Later, when the lamp was lowered and the cabin quieted, Jonah sat in his chair near the stove and Clara took the other. They didn't touch again, not with Liddy there, but their hands brushed once on the armrest between them. Neither moved away. The moment stretched, solid and certain. Clara lay awake longer than usual that night. She thought about the kiss, about the way Jonah's hand had steadied her back, about how safe she had felt. She also thought about what people in town would say if they knew. She feared their gossip, but more than that, she feared what would happen if Jonah decided this was nothing more than a moment. Yet when she remembered the steadiness of his eyes, she told herself he was not a man who gave lightly. By the time sleep came, Clara had decided one thing. She could not pretend anymore that this was only shelter. Whatever had begun between them was real, and it would not be undone by town whispers or her own hesitation. The next trip into town could not be avoided. Supplies were running low: flour, salt, lamp oil, and Clara knew Liddy needed proper boots before the snow deepened further. Jonah hitched his coat and walked with them down the ridge road, his steps measured, Clara and Liddy keeping close. Clara felt a new unease pressing at her chest. Not because of Jonah, but because she knew the gossip that had already spread would only grow sharper when people saw them together. Still, she refused to let fear show on her face. At the mercantile, conversation dulled the moment they stepped inside. Clara felt every eye turn their way: the shopkeeper, a pair of women near the fabric bolts, 2 men by the stove. Liddy clutched her hand tighter, sensing it too. Jonah said nothing, simply laid his list on the counter: flour, salt pork, lamp oil, and boots small enough for a child. His tone was even, but his presence filled the room in a way that silenced most of the muttering. The shopkeeper, a narrow man with sharp eyes, looked at Clara as he tallied the goods. "You're settled and well up there, I hear," he said, voice carrying. Man like Wild must be expecting something in return. The room went still. Clara's face heated, but before she could speak, Jonah placed a stack of coins on the counter, slow and deliberate. His jaw tightened, and he met the man's eyes with a steady stare that forced the shopkeeper to look away. Jonah said nothing more, only gathered the goods. The moment passed, but Clara knew it would echo in every corner of the town before sundown. As they stepped outside, the deacon of the church intercepted them on the boardwalk. He nodded at Jonah, then glanced at Clara and the child. "A household ought to be put right in the eyes of God," he said. His tone was not cruel, but the weight behind it was clear. Marriage would end talk. Jonah did not flinch. "Men don't live in my cabin," he answered. "I don't marry for their talk." His voice was calm, but Clara could see the muscle in his jaw working. The deacon gave a tight nod, then moved on. Clara felt her throat tighten. She had braced herself for judgment, but hearing Jonah's answer brought a rush of relief she had not expected. He wasn't keeping her there out of shame, nor was he rushing into vows to quiet others. He had already chosen them, whether or not he put words to it. They returned up the ridge in silence, Liddy carrying the new boots proudly. Inside the cabin, Clara set the supplies on the table, her mind turning over the day's events. She knew the questions others would ask. Why had she gone with him? Was she forced? Was she compromising her dignity for shelter? She thought about what she would answer if someone pressed her. The truth was simpler than any gossip. Jonah had asked for nothing. He had only given. That night, after Liddy was asleep, Clara and Jonah sat by the stove. He tested his arm. The burn nearly healed under her bandages. She studied him, the lines of his face carved harder than most men his age, and asked quietly, "Do you regret it? Taking us in?" Jonah shook his head once. "No, cabin's better with you here." He looked at her a moment longer, then added, "I'll speak to the preacher on Sunday." Clara felt her breath catch. It wasn't set out of pressure or to silence the town. It was a choice, plain and steady, the way he had split wood or mended a hinge. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the sudden realization that she wanted that too. She gave a single nod. "All right." When she lay down beside her daughter, Clara stared at the rafters until sleep came. The voices of town still echoed in her mind, but Jonah's words cut through them. "Cabin's better with you here." For the first time since Missouri, she felt like she wasn't passing through someone else's world. She was part of one being built, board by board, fire by fire, choice by choice. Sunday broke clear and sharp, the kind of cold that stung the skin and made every breath burn in the lungs. Clara woke before Liddy, her hands busy smoothing the girl's dress and pinning her own hair into a neat braid. She had nothing finer than her mended calico, but she brushed it until the fabric lay flat and straight. Jonah, standing by the door, buttoned a plain white shirt and tugged the collar into place, the gesture careful, as if he hadn't worn it since better days. He said nothing about nerves, but Clara could see it in the way he checked the buttons twice. They walked down the ridge together, Jonah carrying Liddy part of the way when her small legs grew tired. The snow underfoot crunched in rhythm with their steps. Clara's heart pounded harder with every stride, not from doubt in Jonah, but from the weight of the town's eyes she knew would follow them. She worried Liddy would hear unkind whispers, that she herself might be judged for rushing into vows. But when she glanced at Jonah, his jaw steady, his grip firm on Liddy's hand, she felt her chest ease. He wasn't doing this for appearances. He was doing it because he had already decided they were his family. The preacher's room was plain, rough benches, a wooden lectern, a Bible worn at the edges. Only the three of them stood before him. No crowd, no flowers, no music. Clara was grateful for that. The fewer eyes, the easier her shoulders rested. Liddy clutched the scarf Jonah had given her that first day, a scrap of wool now softened by use, and held it like a ribbon at a festival. The preacher looked between Jonah and Clara, his voice low but clear. "Do you take this woman and this child as your family, before God and man?" Jonah didn't hesitate. "I already did." His tone carried no flourish, just truth. The preacher turned to Clara. "And do you take this man?" Clara drew in a breath, her eyes locking on Jonah's. He didn't smile, didn't try to reassure her. He simply stood steady, waiting. "I will," she answered, her voice sure. Liddy's small hand slipped into Clara's, then Jonah's, binding them together. The preacher nodded, closed his Bible, and said the words that made it official. When they stepped out into the pale light, Clara expected to feel different, as though the vows would weigh on her shoulders. Instead, she felt lighter, as if the decision had already been made days ago in silence by the stove, and now had only been given words. Jonah adjusted his coat, glanced at her, and asked quietly, "Ready to head home?" The word home landed with more weight than the vows themselves. Back at the cabin, Clara set the pot to simmer with beans and pork while Jonah fetched down a small jar of preserves he had kept back from summer. He set it on the table without explanation, but Clara understood. It was meant as a celebration. They ate together, the three of them, Liddy smearing jam across her bread and laughing when it stuck to her chin. After the meal, Jonah lifted the cradle he had been shaping for weeks and set it beside the hearth. The wood was sanded smooth, the rails even. Clara ran her hand across it, her throat tightening. She laid a folded quilt inside, though there was no need for it yet. A gesture that made the future feel less like hope and more like certainty. As night fell, Jonah kissed Clara in the doorway, slow and sure, before stepping back to let her inside first. It was not the kiss of a man proving something to the world. It was the kiss of a man who had already chosen his place. Clara's heart steadied as she pulled him in by the front of his shirt, a silent answer that she had chosen hers too. The lamp burned low, and outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the air was warm, the table cleared, and for the first time in months, Clara believed that the life ahead would not be built on fear or uncertainty, but on the steady rhythm of work, warmth, and belonging. The thaw came slowly, the kind that turned the ridge road into deep ruts of mud and sent water running beneath the snow until the creek below the mill sang again. Jonah's cabin smelled of fresh pine shavings and bread baked on the hearth, and the routine that had once felt fragile now seemed permanent. Clara moved through the space with ease, knowing where every jar and rag belonged, and Jonah no longer hesitated before saying "our table" or "our woodpile." What had begun as shelter had settled into home. Liddy thrived in the change. She ran outside with her new boots, stomping puddles until mud streaked her dress, laughing loud in a way Clara had not heard in months. Jonah sometimes lifted her high onto his shoulders to reach branches heavy with thawing snow, and she squealed when the flakes showered down. Watching them together, Clara's chest filled with something she had not let herself feel in a long time: safety and the possibility of joy. Clara herself carried news she had not spoken aloud yet. For weeks, she had counted the days, her body confirming what her heart already suspected. She was late, not from hunger or hardship, but from new life. At first, fear had stirred in her. Memories of fever, of loss, of the helplessness she had once faced when her first husband had died. But as she worked by the stove one morning, kneading dough, she realized the fear was quieter here, softened by Jonah's steady presence and the sound of Liddy's play. She told him that evening. He was repairing the hinge on the door when she set the words down as plain as the tools on his bench. "I'm carrying," she said, her voice steady. Jonah froze only for a second before turning toward her. His gaze held hers, heavy and searching, but he did not look away. He set the hinge aside and walked across the room, placing his rough hand against her cheek. "Then we'll be ready," he answered. His tone was simple, as though the matter was already settled. Relief swelled through Clara's chest, stronger than any fear. Jonah finished the cradle soon after, setting it beside the hearth. Liddy placed her doll inside with ceremony, declaring it ready for the baby. Clara laughed, the sound rising free in the small cabin, and Jonah, watching them both, let his lips curve into one of his rare, quiet smiles. Word of their marriage reached town through the preacher, and soon after Jonah insisted they go down to the courthouse to add Clara and Liddy to his land deed. The clerk frowned at first. It wasn't common to list a child, but Jonah said firmly, "Write her name. She's mine now." Clara stood beside him, hand tightening on Liddy's shoulder, her heart twisting with gratitude she didn't try to hide. When the ink dried, Clara knew there was no more question of belonging. By spring, the cabin was a true household. The woods around them rang with the sound of saws and birds returning. Jonah kept up his work with the timber, but he no longer returned to an empty room. Supper was waiting, the child's laughter filling the air, Clara's hands busy with bread or sewing. At night, when the fire dimmed, Jonah's arm found her waist without hesitation, her head resting against his chest as if it had always belonged there. One evening, they sat on the porch watching Liddy skip ropes strung from an old logging line. The sky burned faint with the last light of day, the smell of thawing earth in the air. Clara leaned against Jonah, his hand resting steady on hers. Liddy stumbled and laughed, falling into the grass, and her voice carried high into the stillness. Clara whispered, "She's happy here." Jonah squeezed her hand once. "So am I." In that moment, Clara felt the weight of the road behind her finally lift. There would still be winters, hard days, and work without end, but she knew now they would not face them alone. They had made a family, not out of talk or promises, but out of steady days, small acts, and a simple decision to stay. Inside, the cradle waited by the hearth, a quilt folded neat across it, ready for what was to come. Clara glanced toward it and then back at Jonah, her lips curving into a soft smile. The future no longer felt uncertain. It was here, already being lived, one quiet day after another. The story that had begun on the boardwalk outside the mercantile, with whispers and cold stares, had ended with a household on the ridge where laughter and firelight replaced judgment. And for the first time since she had buried her husband, Clara knew there were no questions left to fear. Their life was set. Their family was whole.